but there's very little specifically on sexual ethics. By the way, if you are interested in reading on the issue of homosexuality in the New Testament, the major author still is Robin Scroggs, in a work called The New Testament and Homosexuality. But there it mostly deals with Paul and not with Jesus. It's a work that's been out probably since the 80s, but anything that's been done since then in biblical studies of homosexuality all builds upon Scroggs. The sexual ethics, the very restrictive, the so-called Puritan ethic, is really a sort of Calvinist reading of Paul. Jesus is silent on a great number of issues. As I say, he talks regularly to Pat Robertson, so you can still hear what Jesus has to say. But you can't do it from the text necessarily. He does apparently talk to some others, but Pat seems to keep him pretty busy. I think Jesus right now is telling Pat, you were wrong about promoting divorce on the basis of Alzheimer's, because ever since then Pat's kind of quieted down a bit.
Now he's telling Herman Cain to run for president.
He's doing what now?
He's telling Herman Cain to run for president.
Oh, yeah. A friend of mine, about a month ago, when Rick Perry was kind of leading the pack or looking to send a photograph from a Methodist church, one of these, changeable signs, and it said, Governor Perry, the voice you hear is not mine. Now go take your meds. Sincerely, God. Put this. Yeah. Other questions? It's a great group. Fun to have still. Oh, yes, sir. Yeah.
You mentioned disagreements or issues with the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
Well, I'm just kind of curious about that, and maybe early or
About what now? About what?
the Sermon on the Mountain.
Yes.
Of Jesus. You mentioned that Kant had
Yes.
a lot of disagreements or issues with that.
Kant rejected the Sermon on the Mount. Kant's an interesting person, and Dr. Merriam is, likely more familiar with Kant than I. I don't know enough about Kant to teach some of the basics, certainly in categorical and hypothetical imperative. And Kant, to me, as a Prussian, really represents the kind of view that prefers the sort of Jonathan Edwards kind of God versus the Jesus who says, well, whatever you did in the past doesn't really matter. Because Kant's whole approach is retributivism, the three words in Greek, de, ontos, logos, deontology, the study of what we must be on the basis of something that's already happened. So Kant calls the Sermon on the Mount, I forgot the German term, but imprudent injustice or something to this effect. Kant is one of the few, he was a pietist. To call him a Protestant wouldn't really even be accurate. He was, there's no really modern category to put him in. Maybe Church of the Brethren, maybe. But as a pietist, he had appreciation for God with the idea of if you do this, this is the punishment. But Jesus come along and saying, well, if you do this, you'll be forgiven. By the way, Jesus, again, there's a great inconsistency there, because there are other times when Jesus says, but if you do certain other things, you won't be forgiven. So even he himself, Jesus himself, says at other times there are things for which you won't be forgiven. One of which is, Jesus says, if you don't forgive other people what they do to you, then you won't be forgiven for the offenses that you commit. So even there are some conditions. That part Kant might like slightly better. That's not Sermon on the Mount, but that's elsewhere in the Gospels. The real problem for Kant with Jesus is the Sermon on the Mount side of Jesus. Kant would probably be relieved that there were some judgmental type things still in there. I love the little story Kant tells when he says, you go to a little village, and if there's a guy that beats people up, then one day he gets beat up, and the whole village feels happy, because now justice has been served. Jesus doesn't seem to lean that direction. Kant is just a fascinating, one of the 5, 6 greatest of Western thinkers, I think most people would say. Whether you agree with them, disagree with them, there's a lot of Kant I appreciate, and there's plenty of them I wouldn't particularly want to live under, but To ignore Kant is to be uneducated in philosophy. I think we could agree on that. To ignore Jesus is to fail to understand Christianity. And to understand Jesus, certainly the Sermon on the Mount is an enormous chunk, though only part of it. After all, it only represents 10% of Matthew's Gospel and about 5% of Luke's Gospel. But it sort of towers above. The common consensus, by the way, among New Testament scholars is not that the Sermon on the Mount was a sermon that Jesus once preached in continuum, but rather that Matthew and Luke have kind of edited the best of Jesus into this one extended sermon. So modern scholarship tends to interpret the Sermon on the Mount not as a single sermon, but as a compendium that the gospel editors pulled together and then put in there. By the way, on the subject of the reversal, I quizzed the students at 11. I have a very fundamentalist young lady who's in my classes, and she quickly gave the answer I thought she would. The question is, which does Jesus say? Blessed are the poor, or blessed are the poor in spirit? And she quickly answered, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's correct when you read Matthew's gospel. Matthew says, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. But Luke says, blessed are the poor. Just like Matthew says, according to Jesus, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. But Luke, Jesus just says, blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty, they will be fed and satisfied. Now, either way you handle this, if you want to say, well, Jesus could have said both, well, of course he could have said both. But the fact that Matthew chose to record one version of it and Luke chose to record a different version, or Matthew changed Luke or Luke changed Matthew, anyway you're left with a finished product that the Matthean and more traditional Jewish Jesus has Jesus rewarding people who hunger and thirst for righteousness and are spiritually impoverished, and the Lucan Jesus, more Gentile and drastically reversal-oriented, has Jesus taking care of the plain old hungry and thirsty, regardless of whether they're spiritual or whether they're righteous. Enormous difference. It's a lot of fun. I hate to, it's getting late, I hate to end all the frivolity that we're having here. But, it's a great time. Any other comments? If someone want to disagree on something? Frankie, anyone else? Any other questions, comments?